Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, friends and society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today. We're going to talk about a number of very important issues, but pull them together in a way that maybe you've never thought about before. And that is, if you've listened to this program any length of time, you know that sometimes we mention the name Francis Schaeffer. He used to say that sometimes we tend to see things in bits and pieces, and we don't see the overall worldview behind it. We don't see the connections between those. And if you think about some of the topics that we're going to be addressing this hour, we in the past obviously talk about issues like abortion and euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism, the hookup culture, and a variety of other topics that we will discuss. And yet they all come together because we have, if you will, kind of a secularist hostility to the body. Now, that may not be obvious at first, so that's why we certainly encourage you to stay with us as we talk about this new book written by Nancy Pearcey. It's entitled Love Thy Body, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality. She, of course, has been on the program with us many times before. You, of course, have heard us interview her on Total Truth, which was a Gold Medallion Award winner. She has certainly written many other books we've talked about, like Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, and the list goes on quite a bit. She is a professor of apologetics and a scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, is also the editor-at-large of the Pearcey Report and a fellow of the Discovery Institute Center for Science and Culture. Author of so many great books, but this one is another one destined to do very well and also to really begin to shake up some of your categories, both biblically and philosophically. So, Nancy Pearcey, always great to have you on the program with us.
Well, thank you, Kerby. It's good to talk with you again.
I would certainly want to encourage people to get a copy of this book. It's over 300 pages, Baker Books, 40 pages I counted of endnotes and bibliography, also a study guide. So even though we're going to work our way through it, and I think a lot of people are going to read the book as individuals, because you always include study guides, this would be a very good small group discussion as well, wouldn't it?
Yes, I've already heard from a lot of people who say that their church is using it, their pastor is making plans to use it, both with the adult Sunday school and with youth groups. Many people may not realize that a book like Love Thy Body, though it deals with complex issues, is actually written at a 10th grade level. You can put your manuscript through the Flesh reading scale, which is what teachers use to make sure that it's at the right, a book is at the right grade level for their class. And Love Thy Body tests out at a 10th grade reading level. So high schoolers can read it, and adults can read it. It's got lots of personal stories, so that even though it deals with complex moral issues, it is very readable and can be used on several different levels, in terms of all the way down to high school, and of course all the way up to any adult level as well.
I might even encourage some of you to encourage or even suggest this book for the Christian school that is in your neighborhood, and see if this might also begin to address some of those very important issues. Well, let's talk about this idea of the body, because certainly we see in Eastern religions and even some of the Greek ideas that I'm not my body is nothing to be paying attention to. Others have, if you will, almost a body obsession. So in the midst of this, you recognize and help us recognize the sort of, if you will, the biblical idea of the body and the biblical idea of personhood. Explain, if you might.
Right. Right. What ties all of these issues together is a low view of the body. And that is kind of counterintuitive for many people because they think that secular people value the body, since many of them are materialists, and they think the physical world is all that exists. But it turns out they really have a low view of the body as a product of blind material forces. That's your body is just a collection of cells and organs and tissues and has no higher purpose or meaning. And we see that lived out. You almost have to show, not tell, as your English teachers used to say. You almost have to show in order to make this credible to people. So let me, if you don't mind, Kerby, I'll start with an example. Let's start with something like abortion. So most bioethicists today will agree that the fetus is human from conception. It's biologically human. And the data from DNA and genetics is just too strong. Nobody really denies, at least bioethicists don't. They really don't deny that human life begins at conception. Well, so then why don't they grant it any legal protection? Well, they say it hasn't become a person yet. And as long as it's only biologically human, it's just a disposable piece of matter. As I said, it's a product of blind material forces. It's just a collection of cells and atoms, just like any other chance configuration of matter. And so it can be killed for any reason or no reason. It can be used in research. It can be tinkered with genetically. It can be harvested for organs and then disposed of with the other medical waste. So do you see that the whole issue of abortion actually rests on a very low view of what it means to be human? That being biologically human is not the basis for human rights. These days, according to secular ethics, being human has no value or dignity. It has no moral standing, does not warrant legal protection, that you have to earn the right to legal protection by acquiring a certain level of cognitive functioning, self-awareness, and so on. So this is actually called personhood theory, and you can see how it presumes that just being human has no value, no significance. You have to be among the select few who qualify as persons. So you see how it rests. People don't usually think about it in those terms, but it is a drastic devaluation of human life, and it affects all of us.
I remember when we were at the Kennedy Institute of Bioethics, one of the books they had us read was Humanhood by Joseph Fletcher, and that was kind of the argument. These individuals, whether you look at abortion inside the womb or euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, or individuals in a coma, they may be humans, but they're not persons, and so then you had to come up with a biological criterion or a cultural criterion or a physiological criterion or a mental criterion, whatever it might be, to define that. And so this personhood theory is something that runs through a lot of the areas of bioethics, for sure. But we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll also pick up some of the other issues as well, because in addition to information that we have about this book, also posted one of your articles, The Silicon Valley's Drug-Fueled Secret Sex Parties, One More Reason to Hate the Hookup Culture. And that's another one of those chapters, which we'll get to a little bit later. But whether it's the hookup culture or whether it's homosexuality or transgender, abortion, euthanasia, or many other issues we will try to focus on, we really want you to begin to think through some of these issues. And again, this book, about 300 pages. No doubt you can probably find it in your local bookstore, but we have a link so that you can get it as well. There is a study guide for each one of the chapters, which would be very good for various kinds of individual or group study. And then, of course, as always, in every one of Nancy Pearcey's books, just a tremendous amount of information with endnotes so that you can check it out for yourself. The new book out, Love Thy Body, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality. Nancy Pearcey with us. By the end of the program, we'll also talk about the great work that's being done there at Houston Baptist University. We'll talk with her about that as well. And we need to take a break. We'll come back with her conversation and yours right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Economic inequality is one of the themes that have run through the presidential election in the past and the congressional races as well. Edward Conard has been challenging many of the myths surrounding the debate. That's why I had him on the radio program to talk about the new book, The Upside of Inequality, How Good Intentions Undermine the Middle Class. 4 years ago, he wrote the controversial bestseller, Unintended Consequences, which attempted to set the record straight on the 2008 financial crisis. He's now trying to set the record straight by debunking the economic myths used to justify more income redistribution. One of those myths is the belief that the rich get richer by making the poor poorer. Central to this belief is an assumption of a zero-sum game. This is certainly true in sports or chess. It isn't really true in America. He makes the case that no other high-wage economy has done more to help the world's poor than the U.S. economy. Related to this is the myth that success is largely unearned. Not only does he address this myth in his book, but he also dealt with it in a recent op-ed in Time magazine. Politicians and economists pushing economic redistribution argue that the successful 1% achieve their wealth from crony capitalism. He notes that 70% of the wealth of the top 1/10 of 1% is owned by self-employed business owners who bested competitors to satisfy customers, not cronies, to earn their success. His book not only debunks various economic myths, but it also plots a way forward. He believes that the challenge facing America today is how to accelerate growth, employment, and wages in an economy. We also need to train America's talent to be more effective, and we need to lower corporate taxes and restrain perennial trade deficits without restraining trade. I wish more political candidates would read his book. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Delighted to have Nancy Pearcey with us today, and again, a professor of apologetics and scholar in residence at Houston Baptist University, author of many good books, including this one, Love Thy Body, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality, published by Baker Books. And Nancy, let's talk about the title for a minute, Love Thy Body. Throughout the book, you really talk about the need for us to have positive responses rather than negative responses. And you know as well as I do, and I speak a fair amount on college campuses and go into other venues where oftentimes Christians are known for what they're against. You're against abortion. You're not favorable towards the homosexual lifestyle and transgenderism and on and on and on. But what you want to do is bring us back to those things that could be a positive message. I've seen this sitting on a board that for many years talked about abstinence, and instead of focusing on the negatives, although we certainly educate young people about STDs and things like that, we talk about really, in a sense, don't say no, just say yes. In other words, yes to dreams and goals and things that are going to help you succeed. And I know really, in a sense, you wrote this book to provide positive responses in a situation where oftentimes Christians are only known for negative responses.
That's right. And I just recently got an email from a friend saying, well, what about homosexuality? You know, don't we come across as just negative and judgmental? And how can we turn the tables by helping people to see, well, actually, it's the homosexual narrative that's negative and that's harmful because it's very demeaning to the body. Think of it this way. Nobody really denies that on the level of biology, physiology, anatomy, males and females are counterparts to one another. That's the way the human sexual and reproductive system is designed. So as a result, when someone adopts a same-sex identity, in essence, they are contradicting that design. Implicitly, they are saying, why should the structure of my body inform my identity? And why should my biological sex as male or female guide my moral choices? So it's actually resting on a disrespectful view of the body. And it also creates inner conflict between my biological identity and my psychological identity. It leads to an internal fragmentation and self-alienation. And so in my book, Love Thy Body, I tell lots of stories of people who found healing from that inner conflict. And how did they do it? They did it by choosing to base their identity on their body as a gift from God. One of them is a young woman named Jean Lloyd, and when she was in high school, she wore a tuxedo to her high school Christmas dance as a symbol of her lesbianism and lived openly as a lesbian for several years. And then she says, I began to trust that God knew my identity more than I did, that he wrote his image on my body as female. He designed my sexuality. And as she put it, I love this line. She says, to my own great surprise, a flicker of heterosexual desire emerged. And today she is married with 2 children. And so what was the key change? She accepted her body as a good gift from God. Our feelings can change, and they often do. So the most reliable marker of who we are is our embodied identity as male and female. So Christian morality is actually in tune with our biology. It leads to a sense of identity that's in harmony with our body. It's healing. It heals that inner conflict. So this is a positive message that we can bring to people, is that we are coming to you as someone who maybe has same-sex attractions, not with just a negative message, but a positive message of the value, dignity, and beauty of your body as a gift from God.
Since we're using an example of a woman, let me come to a section that you put early on in the book that I think is helpful. Why women love Christianity, how ancient culture humiliated women. Because when we've had people like Dr. Rodney Stark on this program and Dinesh D'Souza and a number of historians over the years, we can go through a long list, they point out that really Christianity was liberating for women. And today, of course, if you go to a women's march, you see feminist rhetoric, you go to gender studies, it's always how Christianity has oppressed women. So as a woman, speak to that issue for just a minute, because it does seem to me that that is another corrective that your book provides.
Exactly. A culture that accepts things like abortion and infanticide is a culture that disrespects women. It does not treat women's ability to gestate and bear children as a wonderful and marvelous ability that should be cherished and that should be protected. Instead, it treats women's ability, their biological function, as a liability, as a disadvantage, as a disability that should be suppressed using toxic chemicals, i.e. birth control. Hormones are a carcinogen. They're cancer-producing. And using deadly devices to kill the life within her. I mean, even when I was an agnostic, I spent several years as an agnostic before becoming a Christian in college. And even then, I could sense that this was very demeaning to women. Even then, I joined a group called Pro-Life Feminist. Are you familiar with that group?
I certainly am, yes.
Okay. A lot of people are not, and they say, what? Isn't that a contradiction?
Mm-hmm.
But I was a member of Pro-Life Feminist because I identified as a feminist back then, but I could not accept abortion. It seemed to me like it was a violent incursion into women's natural, healthier biological functions. And when I found out that there was such a group, in fact, I found out that one of the founders of the group lived right down the street from me, so I jumped up, walked down the street, and knocked on her door to join the group. But Christianity has always had a high view of women over against the secular culture, certainly in the early church. One of the things that I was very unsettling when I was doing the research for Love Thy Body was to discover how much the early church had to stand against the ancient culture of Rome and Greece, because it was a very man-centered culture that had a low view of women and a low view of marriage, and where abortion and infanticide were very common and killed a lot of women, by the way, and where a man was permitted, it's totally accepted for a man to have sex with just about anyone. The most common form of infidelity was sex with your slaves.
Yes.
And both male and female slaves, both adult and minor slaves, as well as with brothels and prostitution were widely accepted. Women were not considered, did not have a high status. And I quote Rodney Stark. I'm glad you've had him on the program. But Rodney Stark says, as a historian, women flocked to Christianity because Christianity gave women a much higher position, much higher dignity, and much more security than the surrounding secular culture of the day.
Let's, if we can, just before we take a break, talk about another aspect of this, because if indeed you are convinced that the body isn't of something that needs value, maybe it's because you feel that it needs to be improved. And so that brings us into genetic engineering, or a section you have on transhumanism, a topic we addressed maybe a year ago, but need to come back to. And again, it's that sense that, well, the body that we have needs to be genetically engineered. After all, if everything we see around us is a result of chance and my body is just an accident, certainly intelligent scientists in the laboratory can do a better job of redesigning the human body. And so, again, that comes from the same kind of root of ideas, doesn't it?
Yeah, you're right, exactly. Transhumanism is the idea that if, the logic is, since humans are nothing special, why not use technology to create a new stage of life beyond humanity? That's what transhumanism means. And so transhumanists will say it's time to take charge of evolution through genetic engineering, and that after all, human life as it exists today is merely one step in an endless evolutionary chain. And so it is just a chance configuration of cells that will be surpassed anyway in the next stage of evolution. So why not, as you put it, use our intelligence to direct it in ways that we find desirable?
Amazing.
Of course, the question is, who finds it desirable? Who's going to choose what is desirable? And that is, the answer is whoever has the most power, which means the state. So it will be sold to the public as a way of a consumer-oriented choice. In other words, you can have your children engineered to be smarter, stronger, and more attractive or whatever. That's how it will be sold to the public. But in the end, no state is going to leave that kind of power in the hands of ordinary people.
Amazing. Let's take a break, and when we come back, kind of like the theme in the movie Gattaca and some of the others. But we have a lot more to cover. The book is entitled Love Thy Body. Nancy Pearcey with us today. It's published by Baker Books. If you'd like to know more about her, about the book, or even some of her recent articles, it's all available at our website, pointofview.net. We'll be right back.
Point of View is committed to spreading the truth, oftentimes a truth that those in political power don't like getting heard. But the only way it can be heard is if our team stands strong together, if you do what you can to support the Point of View Truth Team. It's having an impact, as we heard recently from U.S. Representative Louis Gohmert.
Everywhere I go, I hear people that you have influenced, that Point of View has affected. You have made such a difference, and you rely on people to contribute, and if they don't contribute, then that truth does not get heard.
Help Point of View make a difference. Pray and consider what level is right for you. $30, $65, $100 a month, or even more. Please do what you can. 1-800-347-5151, or visit online, pointofview.net. Look near the top right for the link that says Become a Monthly Partner. Join the Truth Team, 800-347-5151, and pointofview.net. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Continue our conversation today with Nancy Pearcey, author of the new book, Love Thy Body. Again, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. Robert George at Princeton University calls it a terrific new book, and just all sorts of accolades from many individuals that we've interviewed on this program about this new book published by Baker Books. And if you'd like to know more, we have information about this book, a way that you can order it if you can't find it in your local bookstore, on our website, pointofview.net. Also a link to some of the material available through Nancy Pearcey, and a little bit later we'll talk about Houston Baptist University as well. And Nancy, there are lots of quotes over the years that I quote you from, and one of those, when we've talked about intelligent design, is how science is not being inhibited by intelligent design. You oftentimes say that intelligent design is not a science stopper, it's a science starter. Well, let me apply it here, because we are told so often by people that are critical of a Christian viewpoint or a conservative viewpoint that you people are anti-science. Well, I got 2 degrees in science. You wrote a book called Soul of Science, and you understand science. Science tells me that human life begins at the moment of conception. Science tells me that even if a person is in a coma, it's possible they could come out of it. So to not treat that person like a person and to not give them legal rights would be dangerous. Again, science tells me that gender is binary, not multiplied. And certainly, even when we come to the hookup culture, when we know something from science and medicine that most people, a majority of people that might be carrying an STD are asymptomatic, they don't know, and you don't know if you'll get an STD. So it seems to me that the people that are on the side of science would be Christians who apply biblical principles and actually believe and see the world the way it really is. What about that?
Yeah, I think it's time for us to turn the tables on this argument. It is certainly true that the Christian ethic is the one that takes into account the facts of biology, whether we're addressing abortion, the scientific facts about when life begins, or when we're talking about sexuality, the facts about sexual differentiation and reproduction. The Christian ethic is the one that treats science and biology much more respectfully. Let me give 2 examples. Let's start with abortion, because you mentioned that already. But think of it this way. If truly the human being as a biological entity is just a piece of matter with no rights, and then somehow it transforms into a person with an inviolable right to life, to where killing it would be a crime, that is a momentous change. We really need to find some facts to support that. There is no transformative point, however, that science can detect objectively. The definition of personhood is completely subjective, arbitrary. Every bioethicist out there draws a line at a different place. So it is not a scientific concept at all. It's a philosophical concept, or even less than that. It's really more of a personal preference than anything else. And the other one is homosexuality. You know, there's an outspoken lesbian who you will know, Camille Paglia.
Mm-hmm.
And I was fascinated to read her defense of homosexuality, and I quote it in my book, Love Thy Body. But she says, there's no doubt about it, nature made us heterosexual. Nature made us a sexually reproducing species. You know, it is not a social construction. Gender is not a social construction. It's a biological fact. It's a fact of nature. And then she says, but why not defy nature? Why not just defy nature? After all, if nature is just a cosmic accident, that product of blind material forces with no higher purpose or meaning, then nature doesn't give us any moral message. Nature doesn't give us any clue to our identity. We have no inherent purpose that we're obligated to respect. And so, and here's her money quote. She says, fate, not God, has given us this flesh, and we have absolute claim to our bodies and may do with them as we see fit. So that is logical. What she's saying is if nature doesn't give us any clues, it has no purpose and therefore give us no clue to our identity, we can choose whatever we want. And of course, on the one hand, that may come across as very freeing. We can make up our own rules. On the other hand, what it means is it's the reason people feel a fundamental despair about their sexuality, because they realize there's no higher meaning, no higher significance. Rolling Stone magazine quoted a young man who said, sex is just one piece of body touching another piece of body. It is existentially meaningless.
Wow.
So that's what young people are up against today. They're up against a materialist worldview, an evolutionary worldview that has taught them that sex has no inherent, no objective meaning, so that on the one hand they can make up their own rules, but on the other hand it's insignificant in the literal sense of signifying nothing. And therefore it's not surprising that they keep grabbing for more sexual experience and more extreme sexual experience, and at the same time feeling more and more unfulfilled and empty.
And that's, again, why they need the positive message that comes out of Love Thy Body. You know, Nancy, one of the things I appreciate so much about your book is not only do you deal with it on the philosophical level and give stories, but as well, you even help parents. I can remember one of your books where you talk about the Berenstain Bears, and oftentimes I will show the slide and talk about how then they have a quote that's basically from Carl Sagan, and I can literally see some of the parents go, not the Berenstain Bears. But you do this again in this particular book about the gender unicorn, the trans ideology for kids. And the point is that sometimes we think that these discussions take place at the university level. Maybe sometimes they slip down into the high school level. But in the grade schools and the middle schools, a lot of these ideas are already being put forward. Talk about that gender unicorn, since you have a picture of it in your book.
Yeah, exactly. And these are things I come across as a parent. A lot of my examples are things that I came across with my own kids. But the transgender ideology is once again the same logic, the same denigration of the body. Because what is it saying? It's saying gender has nothing to do with your biological sex. There's a BBC documentary, and it put it this way. It said at the heart of the debate is the idea that your mind can be at war with your body. So kids down to kindergarten with this gender unicorn cartoon, kids down to kindergarten are being taught that their body is irrelevant to their identity, which is incredibly demeaning to the body, and which is estranging people from their own bodies. And in my book, Love Thy Body, I tell stories of people who suffered from genuine gender dysphoria. The chapter starts with a young boy whose name was Brandon, who was clearly gender nonconforming from the time he was a toddler. He was a very emotional, sensitive, relational boy. Even in preschool, he always played with the little girls. By the time he was in middle school, he was painfully aware that he did not fit the John Wayne masculinity stereotype. And he told his parents, I think the way girls do, I'm interested in the things girls are. God should have made me a girl. And his parents just worked with him extensively to accept his biological identity as a boy. And they said, it's not you who's wrong, it's the stereotypes that are wrong. It's possible to be a boy and fully masculine and to be emotional and sensitive, and God has probably equipped you for one of the caring professions. You're going to be a psychologist. What I draw from that is, number one, the answer is, again, respect for our body, respect for our biological identity. And the church should be the first place where young people have the freedom to think critically and think creatively about gender stereotypes and to find their true gifts and calling before God.
And I think what we see in Scripture is the idea that there are different gifts and different callings, 1 Corinthians 12. And so we recognize that you're going to have different propensities, different abilities, different callings. Not everybody's called to be a hard hat construction worker. Not everybody's called to be a university professor. Not everybody's called to be a doctor or nurse, whatever it might be. And so, again, you can recognize how those can manifest themselves in different ways. And again, even using the biblical idea, not everybody's an eye, not everybody's a hand, not everybody's a foot. And so that certainly is helpful. But when you go to the secular mindset that says, well, the body's just social construction and you don't have to be bound by what God has made you to be and the gifts that God has given you, you can see some of the dangers. So we need to take a break. And when we come back, we'll talk a little bit about this idea of a hookup culture, because by now, I think you probably have a pretty good idea of how sometimes this idea in abortion, euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism really is a repudiation or a degrading of the body. But what about this idea of a hookup culture? We also want to spend just a little bit of time talking about some of the great material available at Houston Baptist University as well, because after all, Nancy Pearcey is a professor of apologetics and scholar in residence there. Let's take a break. The book is entitled Love Thy Body. We'll have more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Smithsonian Institution has appointed its first curator of religion in over 100 years. Peter Manseau, the new curator, explains that you can't tell the story of America without the role of religion in it. According to Manseau, among the first exhibits to be displayed will be a church bell crafted by Paul Revere, Thomas Jefferson's Bible that cut out the portions he did not believe, a manuscript from the Book of Mormon, a Muslim text that once belonged to an African slave, and even a Torah scroll damaged by Hessians during the War for Independence. Manseau also intends to display a compass used by Roger Williams to find his way to Rhode Island when he was exiled from Massachusetts for his religious beliefs, a display that Manseau hopes will help Americans ponder what religious liberty looked like in the context of the founding of our country. The new curator is right. You cannot tell the story of America without telling the role religion has played in making our country what it is today. And that includes the role of religious liberty. These artifacts from our history point to the real stories of Americans committed to the historically radical idea that government respect a person's right to honor his conscience before God. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Nancy Pearcey with us for a few more minutes as we talk about her new book, Love Thy Body, answering hard questions about life and sexuality. And Nancy, let's talk about this idea of a hookup culture, because oftentimes the argument is that we are sex-saturated and we are obsessed about sex. But in some respects, again, if you understand it from your point of view, maybe we place too little value on sex. And that relates to some of the other issues, from the whole issue of sexual harassment, the obsession that so many people have with pornography. In some respects, there is a very clear understanding that when you don't value sex from a biblical point of view, you end up with the sex-saturated culture that we have today.
Yeah, most people, like you say, don't really sense what is the connection between, say, abortion and euthanasia and something like hookup culture. But it does rest on the same devaluation of the human body. So young people, college students, know the rules of the game all too well. They know that the rules is no love, no relationship, no commitment. In my book, Love Thy Body, I quote some of these college students, and it's really quite poignant because one young woman said, hookups are very scripted. You learn to turn off everything except your body. You make yourself emotionally invulnerable. Or another one said, sex should stem from emotional intimacy, but it's the opposite way with us. And another one said it's body first, personality second. So what are they all saying? They're saying that the hookup culture treats sexuality as purely physical, cut off from the whole person. And you're right, some people may think, doesn't sexual hedonism give sex too much importance? But in reality, it's giving sex too little importance because it's resting, again, on the idea that the body is a product of blind material forces and it's no different from any other piece of matter. And so I quote a woman, her name is Donna Freitas, and she's a researcher. She interviewed hundreds of college students, and she found that privately they will admit that they find these meaningless sexual encounters very disappointing, that they feel hurt and lonely, that they wish they knew how to create a genuine relationship in which they are known and loved, that they wish they could move beyond the materialist view of the human nature of the human being as just an organism driven by sheer physical drives. It's the hookup culture is leaving a trail of wounded people, and the reason is that they are trying to live out a worldview that does not fit who they really are.
Let's, if we can, also talk about the fact that these ideas are not only outside the church, but inside them. And in your introduction, you talked about co-optive churchgoers. They're co-opted in terms of pornography, cohabitation, divorce, homosexuality. And near the end of the book, you talked about secular marriage among Christians. Part of the problem, and of course this is something we've addressed with you before, even though we have individuals that are saved in their heart, they're not saved in their head. They may be Christians, but they are not thinking biblically about these issues. And that's one of the reasons, of course, that you write these books.
Yeah, exactly. People don't realize that when they engage in a behavior, they are not just engaging in an act. They are absorbing the secular worldview that goes with that behavior. And in Love Thy Body, I challenge them to think in every decision they make. They are also deciding what kind of cosmos do we live in. Are we products of blind material forces, or are we the handiwork of a personal God whose bodies reflect His loving purpose? And so on that term secular marriage, I use that in particular for the idea that marriage is marriage anything really beyond romance and emotional commitment? There was a teacher at an evangelical college that I quote in the book, and she said, she gave her students an article on the Christian view of marriage, and they hated it. And the reason that they hated it is because they no longer think, even at an evangelical college, the students no longer thought that marriage is about anything beyond romance and emotion and emotional fulfillment. And she said they were unable to recognize that same-sex marriage is a problem because same-sex marriage is based on the same idea, that marriage is just about emotional connection. And so in their view, the only reason you would oppose same-sex marriage was if you were some kind of a literalist who relied on a few disparate Bible verses. And they were unable to see that there's a world view at stake, not just a few scattered Bible verses. But the whole premise that marriage is just a contract that I form when I have an emotional connection to someone goes back to a view of, again, I love the fact that you're so into the intelligent design issue, because you have to push this issue always back to where did it all start from? Do we live in an empty cosmos? Are we basically just atoms bumping around in the void? Or do we live in a cosmos shaped by a personal God? And who has given us directions on how to have relationships that are directed toward the common good? Is marriage something that we invent, that we can make up as we go along? Or is it a social institution that was defined by God and that we enter into? The lovely language of the older marriage ceremonies was, we enter into the holy estate of matrimony. And it's not something that we invent or that we create, but it's a pre-existing reality defined by God that we enter into. And so many young people today, even in the church, do not understand that anymore. They tend to think of it as something that is there just to meet my emotional needs. And once it stops meeting my emotional needs, well, God wants me to be happy, so I can leave. So this is what I'm addressing in especially the last chapter of Love Thy Body is, are our social institutions essentially contracts? Contracts are something we invent, we define the terms, or are they covenants? Are they covenants where God has defined them and they are in line with who we are created to be, and we find our greatest fulfillment in living out covenants that God has given us?
And again, covenants, commitments versus contracts. Just about out of time, let me just mention that we have a link to your website, nancypearcey.com. Don't even have to know how to spell that. It's all available on our website. Also, let me just again encourage you, as we have when we've had various guests that are with Houston Baptist University, to check that out, hbu.edu. And not only, Nancy, can they attend in person, but I know there's all sorts of other ways in which they can participate as well. So thank you so very much for writing this book. Again, it is entitled Love Thy Body, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality, published by Baker Books. And again, we have information about that on our website. So Nancy, look forward to the next opportunity to talk with you once again.
Thanks so much for having me, Kerby. I appreciate it.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll give you a chance to make some comments. I know some of you wanted to join us in the first hour, but I wanted to give her a chance for you to hear from her. But perhaps you have some comments about what we've already covered. Of course, we've covered such issues as abortion and euthanasia, homosexuality, transgenderism, and the pickup culture, hookup culture, to mention just a few. Ben Carson is being criticized right now by an atheist group because he's praying and have a Bible study. Oh, horrors. We're also going to get into a couple of statements being made that are really kind of silly statements about immigration. We have a State of the Union address coming up in the future, actually tomorrow. So these are all topics we're going to cover in the second hour. And, of course, if you'd like to join us, let's open up the phones. An open line in the second hour, 1-800-351-1212, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be back, and we'll take some of your phone calls and get into some other very important issues right after these important messages.
Why should you become a partner with Point of View Radio? Because for decades, this team has made a significant difference in lives and communities across the nation. Because America is dying for lack of biblical wisdom about life and culture. You should give because your gift will make possible cutting-edge information on issues that matter, information you won't hear anywhere else. Why? Because your gift will change lives, because you'll influence our culture with biblical truth, and because you can make a difference for the future. Our nation needs a truth team very badly. Support Point of View Radio today at pointofview.net. Click on Join the Truth Team and choose your level of support. Pointofview.net. Or call 800-347-5151, 800-347-5151. Or mail that first donation to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Point of View will continue after this.
I just want to thank you so much for all the wonderful programming you have. You're just absolutely fantastic.
I recently started listening to Point of View, and I really found it interesting because of the different subjects you cover. Thank you for that.
I really appreciate everything that you do in keeping us informed.
Thank you, Kerby, for everything that you have been doing. I appreciate all the work that you're doing, advocating for the Word of God. Thank you so much.
Point of View, I think, is absolutely necessary because it's a Christian perspective, a biblical worldview perspective, and receive very current, up-to-date information about what is really going on, week to week in our culture, which is changing so rapidly, and yet it's morally sliding backwards.
Yeah, I'm just, first of all, I thank you guys. Y'all's program is wonderful, and enjoy it every day. I learn so much every time I listen to it.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, if you'd like to join our conversation, that number is 1-800-351-1212. First hour, we spent some time talking with Nancy Pearcey about the book Love Thy Body, but we're going to move on to some other topics. But by the way, if we've said something about abortion, euthanasia, physician-assisted suicide, homosexuality, transgenderism, the hookup culture, to mention just a few, we would certainly welcome those phone calls as well. But I wanted to actually get to an issue that I hadn't planned on covering until I've just seen how much criticism Dr. Ben Carson has been receiving. Now, you may remember a while back we talked about how during one of these cabinet meetings, the press was in there, and Donald Trump at the end said, you know, the press, you can stay if you'd like, because I'm going to ask Ben Carson to pray. And he even made the joke about, well, this might actually help you. And Ben Carson prayed. And, of course, there was a flap about having a prayer at the cabinet meeting in the Trump administration. But the bigger flap now has developed because there is a weekly Bible study, which includes a variety of individuals. Such individuals as the CIA Director Mike Pompeo, Jeff Sessions, of course, who is the Justice Department Secretary. You have Betsy DeVos, who is the Secretary of Education. Rick Perry, who is the Energy Secretary. And, of course, Dr. Ben Carson, who is the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. Well, this probably shouldn't surprise you, but it is kind of lamenting that the Freedom from Religion Foundation, have we heard about them? Oh, yes. Even on Friday, Kelly Shackelford was talking about them. They sent out a Freedom of Information Act request to these various departments because they wanted to know if any government resources were used. They also want to know if cabinet secretaries felt pressure to attend the meetings. I doubt it. I mean, there are probably values in not attending some of those meetings because of the kind of criticism that you would receive. And so the question I want to put on the table for just a minute, in case you want to join us, and then we're going to move on to some other topics, is the response from Ben Carson. Because what he said is, I will not stop being a Christian while in the service of my country. And I will read in its entirety what he actually posted a while back on his Facebook page and in some of his press release. But this has caused the Freedom from Religion Foundation to really almost go into orbit, because once they filed their Freedom of Information request, according to the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the request fee can be waived, only waived when the information will significantly aid the public's knowledge of how the government operates. And so they decided, we're going to charge you for that. In other words, there apparently are two different levels. If the freedom of information is just out of curiosity, then you actually can be charged for that freedom of information request. If indeed this is something that is essential to understanding the way a decision is made, in, for example, the Energy Department, the Education Department, in the Justice Department, and the CIA, or even in Housing and Urban Development, then you don't have to pay for that. So it's almost as if there has been a kind of lines drawn in the sand. And so what you have right now is the Freedom from Religion Foundation, I should say, actually has sued the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they've sued Secretary, or Dr. Ben Carson, And so they've been joined in the legal action by another group called Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. And so what Dr. Carson has said is I'm just not going to be intimidated. So let me, if I can, read this, and then I'd love to hear your comments. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Do you think Dr. Carson should back down and simply say, okay, this maybe is not appropriate for members of the Trump administration to meet once a week for a Bible study, or should he stand his ground? I'd love to hear what you have to say about that. But here's the full text of Dr. Ben Carson's remarks. He said, the Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington are apparently filing a lawsuit against HUD and me, alleging that they are being treated unfairly because they're required to pay a standard fee when requesting information through the Freedom of Information Act regarding my participation in a weekly Bible study for cabinet members. They are fearful that a hot beverage or a bagel may be consumed at the expense of taxpayers, or that staff may be coerced to participate in religious activities against their will. He says, first of all, taxpayer funds are not used to support the ministry, and secondly, no staff are involved in the Bible study. More importantly, I refuse to be intimidated by anti-religious groups into relinquishing my spirituality or religious beliefs. One of the principles of our nation's founding is freedom of religion. I will not stop being a Christian while in service to this country. In fact, it is my faith that helps me serve the nation even better. The relentless attacks on the spirituality of our nation must be resisted. We are not like everyone else, which is precisely the reason we rose so rapidly from obscurity to become the most powerful and free nation in history. He then concludes by saying, we sometimes smugly say that we won the Cold War with the Soviet Union, but it was Joseph Stalin, the Russian tyrant, who said the United States could be destroyed from within by eroding three things: our patriotism, our morality, and our spirituality. These things are currently under severe attack, and we, the people, must decide who we are and what we stand for. If we don't, the ending of the Cold War might change dramatically. So again, he's made this point about the fact that he refuses to be intimidated by anti-religious groups into relinquishing his spirituality and religious beliefs. Makes the case that he actually perhaps is functioning more effectively because of this. So over the next couple of weeks, you may be hearing more about this. I wouldn't be surprised if tomorrow night Donald Trump maybe even mentions this, that various cabinet members get together for a weekly study. He may not, but if he does, at least you'll know where it comes from, because it has to do with this lawsuit, which has been brought first by the Freedom from Religion Foundation, as well as other groups, Citizens for Responsibility and Ethics in Washington. So what are your thoughts? Is Ben Carson just making a big deal out of nothing, or is this something worth taking a hard stand on? We are learning more and more every single day about the fact that there are times in which there are prayers at the cabinet meetings and in other meetings in the Oval Office. We're hearing about Bible studies. We're hearing about a significant number of Christians that have actually been serving and are continuing to be nominated and confirmed for various positions within this administration. So what are your thoughts about that? If you'd like to join us, that number is 1-800-351-1212. I know some of you actually voted for Ben Carson when he was running for the presidency. He now serves, of course, as the Secretary of HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And so I'll come back and maybe take some of your phone calls. But I'll also get into another issue, because we're starting to see more and more of these companies. As a matter of fact, about 250 that we can count so far that actually are paying bonuses, usually $1,000 bonuses, sometimes as much as $3,000 bonuses. And the reaction from the Democrats has been interesting, and that is, well, Nancy Pelosi referred to these bonuses as crumbs, pathetic, insignificant. And, of course, you have Debbie Wasserman Schultz, former chairwoman of the Democratic National Committee, saying, well, I haven't seen too many bonuses more than $1,000. And so I want to come back and talk about whether $1,000 makes a difference to you and your family. If you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. We'll be right back.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Economic inequality is one of the themes that have run through the presidential election in the past and the congressional races as well. Edward Conard has been challenging many of the myths surrounding the debate. That's why I had him on the radio program to talk about the new book, The Upside of Inequality, How Good Intentions Undermine the Middle Class. 4 years ago, he wrote the controversial bestseller, Unintended Consequences, which attempted to set the record straight on the 2008 financial crisis. He's now trying to set the record straight by debunking the economic myths used to justify more income redistribution. One of those myths is the belief that the rich get richer by making the poor poorer. Central to this belief is an assumption of a zero-sum game. This is certainly true in sports or chess. It isn't really true in America. He makes the case that no other high-wage economy has done more to help the world's poor than the U.S. economy. Related to this is the myth that success is largely unearned. Not only does he address this myth in his book, but he also dealt with it in a recent op-ed in Time magazine. Politicians and economists pushing economic redistribution argue that the successful 1% achieve their wealth from crony capitalism. He notes that 70% of the wealth of the top 1/10 of 1% is owned by self-employed business owners who bested competitors to satisfy customers, not cronies, to earn their success. His book not only debunks various economic myths, but it also plots a way forward. He believes that the challenge facing America today is how to accelerate growth, employment, and wages in an economy. We also need to train America's talent to be more effective, and we need to lower corporate taxes and restrain perennial trade deficits without restraining trade. I wish more political candidates would read his book. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For more information about issues covered on Viewpoints, visit pointofview.net. Pointofview.net.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
I'd like to join a conversation, 1-800-351-1212. One of the big criticisms coming right now is even though you have 250 companies that have been able to provide $1,000, sometimes as much as $3,000 bonuses, some of the Democratic leaders like Nancy Pelosi and Debbie Wasserman Schultz have said this is pathetic, these are crumbs. The good news is you know, go back to Twitter and find Nancy Pelosi a couple of years ago when there was a benefit that was provided under President Barack Obama, which ended up being about $40 per paycheck, which is about $1,000 a year. They thought that was really a good idea, but now they're saying it's just pathetic that they're only giving $1,000 bonuses. And yet, in my commentary that I had come out earlier this month, I pointed out, when you talk about $1,000, that's pretty significant. 59% of Americans, when asked by a survey by the Federal Reserve if they could come up with $1,000 for an emergency, said no. So, I mean, a majority of Americans say, you give me $1,000, that's really good. And yet, we'll get into that and more in just a minute. I see some of you, though, would like to address this issue of Ben Carson. Again, let me be clear. It's not the lawsuit that has come against Ben Carson and Housing and Urban Development is about their request that the Freedom from Religion Foundation actually pay for the Freedom of Information requests. They're not necessarily suing him because he and Rick Perry and Jeff Sessions and Betsy DeVos and Mike Pompeo and others are having a Bible study. I think they'd like to, but nevertheless, this is the issue of whether or not they should have to pay for this. And, of course, Ben Carson has stood his ground. Is this something that is a battle worth fighting, or should he just simply capitulate? I think I know what some of the answers are as I look at the screen, but let's get a comment or two from some of you in terms of the flap that is now surrounding former Doctor and now Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Ben Carson. So we'll go to the state of Texas first, KSWP, and Robert. What's your thoughts?
I just get so sick and tired of all these guys wanting to come at somebody because of their Christian faith. And I want to stand up and I applaud Ben Carson for standing his ground. I supported him when he ran for president. I support him now. I think he's doing the right thing, and I think them other folks just need to leave him the heck alone and let him do his job.
Well, again, I would encourage you to pray for him. We might figure out a way we could even send a letter of encouragement. I don't think, unless you've ever lived in Washington, D.C., and I have when I went to Georgetown, the amount of pressure that comes on you. I mean, all of a sudden there's articles in the Washington Post, and there are people talking about this. And every time you're giving a speech, there are microphones saying, well, what do you think about the Foundation for, the Freedom from Religion Foundation? And what do you think about this lawsuit, Dr. Carson? I mean, it's a tough road to hoe simply because he's got a Bible study. This would not have been controversial a few years ago, but almost everything is controversial now, partially because they're part of the Trump administration and partially because we have a much more secular society. So, Robert, I appreciate your comments. Let's go to the state of Georgia and talk to Georgia. Thank you for joining us today.
Yes, I just want to make a comment about the freedom from religion itself. I have a belief that I think that freedom from a group called themselves Freedom from Religion, but they themselves have a religion. They have a belief. They have a way that they want to do things. So you can turn that into, they really have their own doctrine, and yet they want their religion to be the religion. And I get it is about God, but then they haven't defined religion yet. What is religion? And the truth is they have a religion too.
Sure.
And they want their religion to dominate, while godly religion that worships the Lord, they're not supposed to function. But in freedom, in a free country, they can be atheists if they want to. That's freedom, but that's their religion. But my personal belief is that they have just as much religion as a Christian does.
Yeah, there was a Supreme Court case years ago in which they suggested at the time, the justices then, that secular humanism itself was kind of a religion. And back to the conversation we had in the first hour with Nancy Pearcey, that's probably the case, because if you define religion as something that has a religious leader, well, no, secular humanism does not. It has a humanist manifesto. It has some followers. But if you say that it's a worldview and it is something that people deeply hold to, and you define that as religion, well, then you would certainly say that to be the case. So if nothing else, there has been an attempt to really kind of enforce kind of secularism in our society today. And here's one more example where having a Bible study, a weekly Bible study with Rick Perry, Energy Secretary, Betsy DeVos, Education Secretary, Mike Pompeo, who was formerly a member of Congress, is now the CIA director. Jeff Sessions, of course, is in the Justice Department. And, of course, Dr. Ben Carson, Housing and Urban Development. There may be some others, but those are the ones that are in this article. They're all just being criticized because they're getting together for a Bible study. And so then the Freedom from Religion Foundation is saying, yeah, well, we want to see if any tax dollars were used. And I love his line. So, no, they're trying to figure out whether or not there's a bagel or some coffee or something that came from a government commissary. But after a while, I just want to say to some of our atheist friends, can you just chill out a little bit? But let's see what the rest of you have to say, because I've got a number of comments, and so you are welcome to agree or disagree with what Dr. Ben Carson is doing. Then we'll move on to some other topics. Let's head to New Hampshire. WSEW. Bob, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. I'd like to make a comment about the ACL, the Freedom from Religion Foundation.
Sure.
They're just a bunch of bullies. The only people they sue are the people that can't afford to pay what they're asking. It's out of the ACLU textbook.
Yeah, the ACLU and Freedom from Religion Foundation and the Americans for Separation of Church and State, they're all very similar. Yes. Well, and again, they do intimidate, because I saw one the other day where there was a field trip that a California group was taking, and because the field trip was going to a place that was controlled by Christians. In other words, like a Christian camp, they said, you can't do it. So they said, okay, we won't do that. I mean, really? I mean, trees are trees and animals are animals. But, you know, that anything that could be even in any way tied to religion is now being used by the Freedom from Religion Foundation to intimidate people. Most of the time, these are just letters. Sometimes they're court cases. And as you've heard us talk about on Fridays with Kelly Shackelford, I'm pretty sure I'm right. They've won every single case against them. So it isn't that they have.
Actually, when you take people like that to court, most of the time, if it ever gets to court, people like the ACLU, Freedom from Religion Foundation, will lose because they're bucking the Constitution.
That's right. Well, again, that's why we're trying to educate you. And again, we'll since there's a number of calls, let me just take some more here. I think Josh in Arizona wants to talk about this idea of separation of church and state. So, Josh, what would you like to add to our conversation today?
Well, thank you, Mr. Anderson, for taking my call. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, my pastor is a very outspoken man. He's a West Point graduate. He studied the Constitution, and he told me, and then I looked it up, that our Constitution, nowhere in it is there a separation of church and state. There is nowhere in our law that says you can't be a Christian and hold office. And I know that's not the main point of what's going on with.
But it's a good point. Matter of fact, I might even say right now for anybody watching online, I'm holding up this booklet that we've made available from Point of View, and it's called The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. And I do this, and I give these out to people all the time because sometimes they'll say, well, what about separation of church and state? And I said, okay, can you turn to the page here on the Constitution? And I go, okay. Now, can you show me where the phrase separation of church and state appears? It's on about page 18. And they keep looking, and they keep looking, and they keep looking, and they go, I don't know. I said, well, I'll help you out here. The words church, state, and separation, none of those words are even in the Constitution, much less the phrase. And so sometimes just giving somebody one of these booklets and say, just read the Constitution, you're going to come to a remarkably different answer. And you're fortunate you have a pastor that's obviously educating himself about that.
Yes, sir. And I really appreciate listening to your program. I'm a delivery driver, and I listen to you guys all day. And you know what? I learn so much every day, and I just want to thank you for that, and thank you for your time.
Well, thank you so very much. We need to take a break. I've got a few leftover calls here on Ben Carson. We'll get into a couple of these other issues. Let me just mention, if we have time, otherwise I'll get to those tomorrow, one article we've posted on Stop the Silly Statements About Immigration if you really want to reach an agreement. That is obviously going to be part of the State of the Union address tomorrow night. And then also America First Triumphs in Davos. And that is last week, of course, President Trump went to Davos, Switzerland, which is really a place where more kind of liberal politicians and globalists go, and he was willing to go and speak right in the midst of all of that. So I do want to encourage you, even if we don't get to all those today, to read those articles, and those are ones we've posted on our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to join us, I'll take a few more phone calls, 1-800-351-1212, then we'll move on right after this.
With the way things are going right now, there's got to be a source of truth somewhere.
Eric lives in California, and he's listened to Point of View since he was a child hanging around his dad's auto shop in Nevada. He says it's his only trustworthy source of information about what's happening in the world.
Well, I feel bad because I have not been donating, and I'll tell you what, I'm getting back to that because just recently I realized with all the junk going on with all the media, with all these news things, the only one that I count on is you guys, and what would I do if you guys weren't there? I don't know what I'd do. Where would I get my news? And I would be dead in water. So I got to do my part.
Make sure you do your part, like Eric. Join the Truth Team. Get all the details by calling 1-800-347-5151 or visit online, pointofview.net/team. Support the truth and make a difference for the future. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. 800-347-5151 and pointofview.net/team. Point of View will continue after this.
are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Half hour. If you'd like to join our conversation, 1-800-351-1212. Just joined us. We were talking about the fact that there is a lawsuit that has been brought by the Freedom from Religion Foundation against the Department of Housing and Urban Development and Dr. Ben Carson. Now, it's not about the Bible study per se, but they wanted to get freedom of information, and the argument that is made is that you have to provide freedom of information requests free of charge if indeed it is information that will significantly aid the public's knowledge of how the government operates. These are individuals, Betsy DeVos of the Secretary of Education, Rick Perry, Energy Secretary, Mike Pompeo, CI Director, Ben Carson, of course, Department of Health, Housing and Urban Development, as well as Jeff Sessions of the Justice Department, that are getting together for weekly Bible studies. So the suit has nothing to do necessarily with the Bible study. It has to do with the Freedom of Information Act. But it's caused Ben Carson to say, I will not stop being a Christian while in the service to my country, and saying that if anything, he is convinced that his faith actually helps him serve the nation even better. And so I just wanted to ask if you thought that was something he should stand up and deal with. It provides sometimes an educational opportunity because just as Josh shared a little bit about church and state, I see another caller that wants to educate us a little bit about some of the church-state terminology. So let me go to the state of Maine, WSEW. Steve, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Hi, yes, thank you. So I was always led to believe through readings that I've done that the separation of church and state terminology came to be via a lawsuit that took place around 1947 to 49, somewhere in there.
Yes, it was, the Everson case, Justice Hugo Black. Go ahead.
Yes. And, I was just reading Derek Max's Bonhoeffer book, and I just got to a portion of it where it was talking about his inability to address a group of students he was going to be addressing on a professional level because of America's stance on separation of church and state. Now, that time period of that was 1931, and that took me by surprise.
Yes. Well, and I think what you had is two issues. You had this idea of a wall of separation, which was actually something from, if I remember right, 1802, in which you had the letter from Thomas Jefferson to the Danbury Baptist Association. So you had sort of a little bit of a concept of separation of church and state, but it actually became, if you will, part of the legal statement in 1947 when Justice Hugo Black took that metaphor and used it in the case called Everson versus the Board of Education. And really, that's chapter 7 in my new book, Christians in Government, A Biblical Point of View, where I take you through kind of the history from Thomas Jefferson through Hugo Black, and then also quote from some of the other places where it was used. But where it had legal standing was after 1947. Now, again, it was almost like a footnote. It didn't really surface in a significant way until about 1962 when you have the prayer case, 1963 when you had the Bible reading case and a number of others. But the legal decision comes in 1947. But some of the mindset, especially since you had the Humanist Manifesto 1, were already starting to surface in the 1930s. So I think that's how I would answer that question.
Awesome. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for asking it. And again, one of the things that I like to do every once in a while is when we have a case, in this case, a suit against Ben Carson and the Housing and Urban Development, sometimes that can be a teaching time. And if you don't have a copy of my book, Christians and Government, A Biblical Point of View, we have it available at Point of View. Chapter 7 takes you through the separation of church and state from Thomas Jefferson all the way to the Supreme Court decisions, how the First Amendment was put together, what sponsorship versus accommodation means. And then I have Chapter 8 on different views of church and state, how some people have dealt with that particular issue. So, again, those are the reasons we put these books together, So if you want to read a little bit more about it, it's available, and you simply can go to the bookstore at pointofview.net. Let's take a few more phone calls here. We'll head to South Carolina. Kimberly, what would you like to ask today?
Well, I would like to know how differing the Christian point of view is from the Committee of Ethics. I mean, if we're talking ethics and morality, in what way does Christianity conflict with their doctrine? I don't understand it. And I think Dr. Carson needs to stand where he is. I wanted to vote for him for president. I campaigned for him. And I just think he's a very good leader and a good ambassador for Christianity.
I would think so. Well, again, this is not something that's going to be covered in the mainstream press, but for those of you that know Dr. Carson, and I've had a chance to stand on a stage with him, I've had a chance to interview him a number of times, what a quality individual. What a great family, by the way. I love his wife. I love him. And I just have such respect for him. Theologically, he and I disagree on one or 2 points, but, that's understandable. But, I mean, forget that. I mean, he is a great ambassador, like you say, for Christian ideas. At a weekly Bible study with Betsy DeVos and Rick Perry and Jeff Sessions, Mike Pompeo, and some others. And so I think it's sad that he's even having to deal with this. So if nothing else, pray for him. And maybe we can find a way to maybe come up with an action alert where we can send a note or petition or something but of course you can do that right now if you wanted to write to him and just say, I stand with you. I'm sure he would appreciate that. Well, let me take one more phone call real quick here, and didn't mean to cut you off there, Kimberly. I was going to go on to Barbara in Missouri because I know she had some things to add to the conversation. So, Barbara, thank you for calling today.
Oh, my. I am so thankful that I was listening today. I applaud Dr. Carson. When he was going to be president, I would have voted for him, but I'm glad Mr. Trump won that because I voted for him, too, or I voted for him in the final election. Dr. Carson is a grand Christian, and I am so thankful he's not scared to stick to his guns and stick to the Word. And I pray, and I'm going to be praying more specifically now for him, that he will be able to speak carefully and accurately and share the Scriptures and encourage the other men and women, too. So God bless him in the position he has.
Well, thank you. And again, I would encourage you to do that because if you can send a note of encouragement, but we can construct something that would make that possible, or just to pray for him. I don't think any of us that have never lived in Washington, D.C., and I have once when I went to Georgetown University, have any idea the kind of pressure that can come on you almost instantaneously. The pressure that comes from reporters sticking a microphone in your face, asking you about this, the pressure that comes from having to defend yourself in a court of law, having to file depositions, whatever it might be, the pressure that comes when all of a sudden you no longer are invited to some of the parties because you're seen as persona non grata. I mean, this is difficult. And again, I appreciate the fact that he said, I will not stop being a Christian while in the service of my country. And he says, I refuse to be intimidated by anti-religious groups into relinquishing my spirituality, religious beliefs, and then goes on to talk about freedom of religion. So he understands the issue, and wanted to use that as maybe a teaching time. But let me also mention one of the other issues you're going to be hearing about, and that is something I mentioned already at the last segment, and that is we have about 250 companies now that have decided to award bonuses or pay hikes. That comes from research done by Americans for Tax Reform, in case you want to get the number. And yet it has been interesting to me to see some of these various Democratic leaders that have just sort of poo-pooed, made fun of, lambasted the idea of a $1,000 bonus. And yet if you read my commentary that came out January 12th, because there they were talking about the fact that the tax cut to most middle-class Americans would be, quote, only $1,000 per year. Well, now, in addition to getting a tax cut of $1,000 a year, a lot of these people in these 250 companies are getting a bonus of $1,000. And in case, you are one of those elites that don't live in the world where the rest of us do, the survey that was done a number of years ago by the Federal Reserve asked Americans this: if you had a $400 emergency, how would you pay for it? And 47% said they would either have to borrow money or sell one of their possessions. But if you then go to $1,000, when they ask, well, what if you had an emergency of $1,000, 59%, when asked if they have resources to cover a $1,000 emergency, could not do so. Nearly 6 in 10. So I know that it's real easy for members of Congress that make more money, probably pay more in taxes than you and I make, but they can kind of make fun of and make a joke about a $1,000 bonus or a $1,000 tax cut. But you know what? We live in the real world. You give me $1,000, that would change everything, and it would for you probably as well. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Welcome to the First Liberty Briefing. I'm Jeremy Dice. The Smithsonian Institution has appointed its first curator of religion in over 100 years. Peter Manseau, the new curator, explains that you can't tell the story of America without the role of religion in it. According to Manseau, among the first exhibits to be displayed will be a church bell crafted by Paul Revere, Thomas Jefferson's Bible that cut out the portions he did not believe, a manuscript from the Book of Mormon, a Muslim text that once belonged to an African slave, and even a Torah scroll damaged by Hessians during the War for Independence. Manseau also intends to display a compass used by Roger Williams to find his way to Rhode Island when he was exiled from Massachusetts for his religious beliefs, a display that Manseau hopes will help Americans ponder what religious liberty looked like in the context of the founding of our country. The new curator is right. You cannot tell the story of America without telling the role religion has played in making our country what it is today. And that includes the role of religious liberty. These artifacts from our history point to the real stories of Americans committed to the historically radical idea that government respect a person's right to honor his conscience before God. To learn how First Liberty is protecting religious liberty for all Americans, visit firstliberty.org.
More people today are saying Americans don't really need religion, but America does need religion. Religion helps the economy, families, and even national security. Learn more by reading Saving America, 10 Reasons Religious Freedom is the Key to Our Nation's Future. You can download this free booklet at firstliberty.org/Saving America. That's firstliberty.org/Saving America. Discover 10 ways religion benefits America at firstliberty.org/Saving America.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Okay, for a few more minutes, if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. One of the things we do here at Point of View is post various articles, and one of those that we have posted today is by Larry Kudlow. Boy, it's been years since we've had him on, but anyway, it's entitled America First Triumphs in Davos. Now, you got to understand that there has not been a president gone to Davos, Switzerland, which is kind of a who's who of government leaders, business leaders. They tend to be pretty liberal, progressive. They aren't the kind of people that George W. Bush or you would even think Donald Trump would go to. Actually, interesting enough, even Barack Obama did not go there, although he would fit very easily in there. Certainly, of course, Bill Clinton did. But Larry Kudlow puts it this way, quote, America's open for business and we are competitive once again, end quote. He said that was just one of the key lines in President Trump's highly successful Davos speech this week. By the way, I got a feeling we're going to hear it tomorrow night in the State of the Union address as well. Anyway, Larry Kudlow goes on to say, of course, in going to Davos, Trump entered the lion's den. A year ago, such a visit would have been a poor idea. Back then, elitist heads of state, the European Union bureaucrats, and the international CEOs were uniformly against Donald Trump. But he says Trump's 2018 Davos strategy was a brilliant stroke, he says. Now, he said the core of the message is this: there has never been a better time to hire, to build, to invest, or to grow in the United States. And so, of course, some of these policies have made a huge difference. Larry Kudlow a little bit later goes on to say, by slashing individual and corporate tax rates, providing 100% immediate expensing for plants and technology, and making it easy for big companies who fled our high-tax system to bring the money back home, he has ended the war against business and investment. Then a little bit later, he says more than 250 American companies, we just talked about that a minute ago, have announced gigantic investment projects, paid sizable bonuses to their workforces, increased 401k contributions, and raised corporate minimum wages and other benefits. And he even says, didn't Apple just announce a $350 billion in new investment projects? And then he goes on to say something I just mentioned a minute ago. He says, Democrats say the incredible business response to tax reform is nothing more than one-time crumbs for workers. But then again, Larry Kudlow says, didn't Walmart, which has bitterly fought attempts to raise the federal minimum wage, just raise the internal minimum wage for virtually all of its wage earners, give bonuses to up to $1,000, expand maternity and parental leave, and commit $5,000 for every employee who adopts a child? Yeah, they certainly did. And, of course, Larry Kudlow talks about the fact that when this was being discussed, all the critics of Donald Trump belittled the idea that a corporate tax cut would actually increase wages. But he says in faster than a New York minute, several million wage earners have already benefited. The estimates are probably about 3 million employees and 250 companies received a bonus. Those bonuses that everybody's been making fun of on the Democratic leadership side? Well, I think for some of us, $1,000 would make a lot of difference. And then finally he says, don't forget the president's argument about the importance of regulatory reduction. Regulation is stealth taxation, Donald Trump said in Davos. We are freeing our businesses and workers so they can thrive and flourish as never before. And, of course, don't forget the Trump tax bill ended the Obamacare individual mandate and opened the door to energy drilling in Anwar and much, much more. So you can read the entire Larry Kudlow argument and discussion. But one other article that I've posted here are silly statements about immigration. And he says, Bruce Bialowski says, it is time, really high time, that politicians from both sides of the aisle stop telling us about the huddled masses which their families were a part of more than a century ago when they came to this country. He says the statements are quaint, but have little relevance to the world today. Speaker of the House Paul Ryan reminded us of his Irish forebears from times gone by, really adds nothing to a sophisticated discussion of our 2018 immigration policy in a high-tech economy. Because he says, we're a high-tech society. We need people to work in our restaurants and clean our hotel rooms and pick our strawberries. But how many of those people do we need, and how many are just taking jobs from Americans of lower work skills entering the job market? And he points out that, we've, first of all, talked about the huddled masses, but then we also talk about what he says, our diversity is our strength. And he says he thinks that's a silly phrase as well. He said, who made this up? And why has it become a mantra? As someone who has traveled all over the world, I love interacting with people from countries we visit. I'm always asking people in America what their national heritage is and hearing about their background. I love being at a sporting event where they honor a military hero of the game and hear their name indicates that they are from a newer immigrant group as opposed to descendants of the Pilgrims. It is truly inspiring, he says, to have grasped enough about this country is to volunteer for our armed services. But this silly phrase, as he points out, is nothing more than a catchphrase. And he points out that, his own background comes from Lithuania. This last week I was gone and I was teaching at the Word of Life in Budapest, Hungary. And we had students there from Hungary and Romania, Ukraine, Lithuania, Austria. We also had some from the United States and Canada, as you might imagine, from South America like Venezuela, Brazil, to mention just a few. And obviously that is the case. And he points out that his family came from Lithuania. But the point is, this is a different world now. We're bringing people in where we're going to have self-driving cars, where truck drivers may be out of jobs because of some of the technology being developed, where the most important needs we have right now in employment are in the biotech industry, in biochemistry, in computer programming, in the information society. And certainly we need to be thinking more rationally about the world that we're bringing individuals into. And if they don't have the requisite skills, they by definition are probably going to end up on the welfare rolls or end up in very low-paying jobs. So again, he's got a whole series of things, of these silly statements about immigration that are not helpful for our discussion. And of course, you know that tomorrow night, President Donald Trump, issuing, again, the State of the Union address, which is required by the Constitution, is going to talk about this issue of immigration, about DACA, which stands for Deferred Action on Childhood Arrivals, and the Dreamers, and some of this. But we need to have a discussion that is based upon the reality of the 21st century high-tech American economy, not one that harkens back to the 19th century, where if you came with a strong back and a work ethic, you would succeed. There are those who still will succeed, but there are going to be needs for us to have people who have the training necessary to succeed in this economy. That's true not only for the immigrants, but it's also true for something we need to teach our kids, that they better make sure that they study, because if they're going to compete in this global economy, in this high-tech society, they better have some skills that will help them to be effective. Well, that's all we have for today. If you did not have a chance to hear the interview we did in the first hour with Nancy Pearcey, Love Thy Body, just an outstanding new book, and we have information about that on our website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to read a little bit more of some of these articles about immigration, about Davos, and I'll see if we can find out a little bit more about the kind of pressure that Dr. Ben Carson is under right now, as this atheist group, the Freedom from Religion Foundation, is suing him and the Department of Housing and Urban Development. We'll follow how that plays out. And, of course, tomorrow we'll spend some time looking at the advance information we have about the State of the Union address. We'll also have a book interview that we'll be doing as well. And so I hope you'll join us every day here on Point of View. In case you'd like to find some of these articles, in case you'd like to know more about the book by Nancy Pearcey, you can find it on our website, pointofview.net. And as you go there, I hope some of you might consider what you might do to support this ministry. A one-time gift, or even joining the Truth Team for $1 a day or $30 a month, $360 a year, is a way that you can keep these programs coming to you every single day. I want to thank Andrew and Steve for their help behind the scenes. Looking forward to a great week. See you back here tomorrow, right here on Point of View.
Is religious freedom still a cornerstone of the Republic, or has it effectively been crushed by the forces of tolerance? America needs Christians to be informed and as unified as possible, applying God's wisdom to civic life. Point of View can be a key part of a successful